Hey everyone, Raptor Chatter here, and we're going to be looking at what happened in July 2024 in paleontology. And I apologize for my voice and being late on this. COVID, and then gouging my hand open and getting a tetanus shot, which then caused my body not to fully recover from COVID, so I had bronchitis, so I am all over the place as far as my actual speaking ability, and I apologize for that. Getting started with Baiyinosaurus baojiensis, a new species of stegosaur coming from the Middle Jurassic of China. It's a bit different than other stegosaurs, in part because of the frontal bone, which is actually wider than it is long, something that we don't see in other stegosaurs. Additionally, that same frontal bone extends towards the back of the skull into parts of the temporal fenestra, specifically the supratemporal fenestra. These are fenestra which allow muscle attachments to move from the top of the head down to the lower jaw and help to power the bite. It was found to fall outside of other early stegosaurs like Baiyinosaurus, and also away from later lineages like those that would lead to Chunkingosaurus. This really suggests that these early stegosaurs were diversifying pretty rapidly, and weren't actually directly leading into things like the ankylosaurs like has been previously suggested. They seem to be doing very much their own kind of thing. Stegosaur trackways are also pretty rare when you're thinking about how common certain other dinosaur trackways are. For example, there's many thousands of trackways made by theropods, but we just don't see nearly as many for stegosaurs. That said, most of the ones that we do have come from Iberia, so Spain and Portugal. A study of these tracks has identified all of them as deltapodous, which is interesting because that means that the stegosaur foot shape is being relatively conserved and not going through as many changes as we see in some other groups of dinosaurs. This is despite some variation in the tracks, and that variation seems to be mostly just explained by the different substrates that the foot would have been traveling through. So if it's traveling through mud versus sand, it's going to leave a slightly different shape. So it seems like at least in stegosaurs, foot shape was very, very conservative and didn't go through nearly as many changes as we do see in other groups. There was also a large group of sauropod tracks dating to just around 130 million years ago coming from the UK. There's not really trackways at the site, instead it's just isolated tracks here and there, which seems to indicate that a lot of different organisms, specifically sauropods, were moving through the area. And just all of them left random tracks everywhere, and a lot of them got erased just because other sauropods were walking over those tracks. This area also might be used to find more tracks in the future, as it is the largest area of tracks known in the Purbuck group of the UK. And going back to the Middle Jurassic, there's more tracks, this time coming from Morocco. And these are actually in the Atlas Mountains in parts of northern Morocco. This is really interesting because this has been a really good resource for understanding what was happening in the northern parts of Gondwana during the breakup of Pangaea. The tracks largely seem to be from various theropods and sauropods. However, we do know of body fossils of other things, including stegosaurs, coming from the Atlas Mountains in the Middle Jurassic, such as Adricticlet. So hopefully we'll be able to use these kinds of trackways to understand better what the ecosystem would have been like, and who knows, maybe in some of these sediments we will find more body fossils of some of these track makers, although it'll be really hard to show that those animals specifically made those tracks. There's been an ongoing debate about the stegosaurs Miragaia and Dicenturus, and that's because some authors are actually putting them as the same animal. They're saying, actually no, Miragaia is actually just Dicenturus. This paper though was looking at least the currently named Miragaia specimen, that might be Dicenturus, and was looking at how flexible the tail might have been. Despite stegosaurs being known for their thagomizers, the large spikes at the end of their tail, there hasn't really been a lot of study on the mechanics of their tail. And what they found is that it would have been exceedingly flexible, and in addition, it wouldn't necessarily have been great as a bludgeoning object if it impacted some sort of other object. So if it hit a tree or another stegosaur, it wouldn't be doing clubbing damage the way you see in ankylosaurs. Instead, it really would have been leaving flesh wounds, which is kind of what we expected, but it's nice to have this in paper published form so that people can try and cite this in the future. As for some animals that were using their tails as bludgeoning weapons, you have some of the glyptodonts, giant armadillos like Panochthus, which is really interesting when looking at this one, which has tail trauma. What the researchers found is that tail trauma is consistent with a bludgeoning injury, meaning either it was swinging into something and hit the wrong part of the tail as opposed to the tail club, or potentially it was fighting another one of the same species and the tail club of the other one hit it off the tail club on the other part of the tail where it could become damaged. Based on the study of this animal's tail mechanics though, it suggests that the most flexible part of the tail would have been right at the base, meaning the rest of it would have been strengthened and would actually be pretty consistent with the kind of damage to the ligaments and bones that we do see in the vertebra of the pathologic injured specimen. There's also a look at pterosaur tails, specifically Rhamphorhynchus coming from the Solnhofen limestone, and they were not competing in the same way as you might expect for some of these other animals I was talking about, which probably were using their tails to compete. Instead, this paper was looking to see how much the tail might have influenced flight, and what it found is not very much actually. They also measured a lot of different specimens of Rhamphorhynchus in other parts than just the tail, and what they were able to show is there are a few differences within different specimens, which might be some sort of signal that there was sexual dimorphism in the species. What this then means is that the little flange at the end of the tail of Rhamphorhynchus was probably being used not necessarily for flight again, but more likely as a social or sexual display option, and part of their behavior would be interacting with the different signals being sent by that tail. Propterodactylus frankerlae is a new species of pterosaur also coming from the Solnhofen limestone, which has a great diversity of pterosaurs. Propterodactylus has a lot of traits that are similar to the monofenestratas, this group of pterosaurs with really large fenestra at the front part of the skull. And it was actually found to be the most basal or earliest branching of the pterodactyloids. So things like Pterodactylus, thus the name pro, so kind of early Pterodactylus. This means that some of the more pterodactyloid traits that we normally expect, including some very derived teeth that we see in some of these groups, would have evolved later rather than early on in this lineage. And that makes sense when you're looking at Propterodactylus's teeth, which seem to have been kind of generalist, as opposed to the very hyper-specialist teeth that you get in some of these animals, such as Ptenochasma. As for vertebrates taking into the air, you have bats, and bats are the only flying mammals, and it kind of begs the question, how did they get there? This paper was looking at the arm lengths and the leg lengths in bats and other at least gliding mammals. What they found when comparing those numbers to what we see in animals that are just climbing trees but not gliding out of them is that the gliding mammals of today actually form a really nice midpoint in between the various arm and leg lengths that we now see in bats. So what that means is essentially bats got to the way they are today by basically just being gliding squirrels or flying squirrels, but they don't fly. And then they just continue to have more derived traits over time, causing an increased elongation of the arms and the kind of large membrane that you see extending over the hands. So yeah, it makes sense. It's, very stepwise. Hey, look, we have one of these things climbing trees. We have some of them starting to glide and getting longer arms. And then we have bats developing full-powered flight with very long arms. As for birds, we have Gerald Meyer, who's doing a ton of work with a collector who is finding different fossils of birds in the London clay, and this time we're looking at the gruiforms. Gruiforms today are things like cranes and also the various rails that you can see around different waterways around the world. Naesiornis mesolornithoides and Walbeck-ornis waltonensis are the new species that have been found from there that are related to modern-day gruiforms. Naesiornis was found to be actually a mesolornithid, which is better known from the Messel pit in Germany around the same time, but were absolutely true gruiforms, just they're extinct now. Walbeck-ornis, meanwhile, was found to be not actually a true gruiform, but just outside of the group. What this means is that the gruiforms, and based on the other fossils coming out of the London clay and places like the Messel pit, were really diversifying throughout large parts of Europe, and it means a lot of birds are probably doing that. So what we have is just a really high diversity of Eocene birds right after the impact that killed off the non-bird dinosaurs. And so this is kind of just where they radiated out from. Staying on the birds, we have the Anseriformes, which are actually the ducks and were pretty early branching birds, which you don't normally think about because they're so common, but yeah, they're one of the first bird groups to really start diversifying. Paakinawat avis grandi is a new early Anseriform coming from the Eocene Green River Formation in the US. All of the phylogenies in this paper found it as the sister group to the modern-day magpie geese, of which there's only one species which lives in New Guinea and Australia. So kind of strange to find it in the US originally, and then it migrated seemingly all the way down to Australia and New Guinea, where it's still doing well. The phylogeny also placed some other birds like Vagavis and Presbyornis as near the true anserans, but just outside of that group, meaning they're not quite actual ducks or duck relatives, but they're just adjacent to that, kind of earlier branches and stem ducks, but not actual ones. Molting in modern-day birds is very particular in that the feathers that are closest to essentially the armpit are the first to start shedding, and then the next ones and the next ones and so on, but those are also always being replaced so the bird can still achieve lift. Two fossil Confucius ornithines actually show a very similar pattern in the fossil record. So yeah, it seems like this kind of trait evolved very early on in the bird lineages. However, it's really important to also acknowledge that they looked at a ton of different Confucius ornithines and other early bird fossils, and only found this in 2 of them, suggesting that they weren't molting quite as regularly as we see in modern birds, which molt between once and twice a year depending on the species. Hypnovenator matsubaraetoheorum is a new species of troodontid coming from Japan. The paper goes on to discuss the origins of troodontids, as it does seem like Hypnovenator is actually one of the earliest branching ones, along with Gobivenator from parts of the Gobi Desert. While not super complete, Hypnovenator does seem to be in the same kind of resting posture that we've actually seen in other troodontids, notably Meilong, or the sleeping dragon. What this suggests is their resting posture was already established before the initial evolution of troodontids, and potentially it could have been more widespread throughout the various dinosaur lineages. Harenadraco prima, this one from the Baiyinosaurus formation of Mongolia. Harenadraco is actually the only known troodontid coming from this formation, and that's really interesting because when you're looking at other Gobi formations, such as for example the Nemegt, there's plenty of other troodontids that have already been named there. So it's really helping to fill in this pretty large gap in the late Cretaceous of the Gobi Desert and what kind of some of the smaller dinosaurs that would have been present would have been. It's still pretty partial, being just parts of the pelvis and one leg, but it does seem fairly closely related to earlier troodontids like Meilong, which I mentioned earlier. This is as opposed to what you find in things like the Jejacta and the Nemegt formation, where it seems like there is a different fauna of troodontids moving in. So this may just be the last representative of an older lineage of troodontids living in Central Asia at this time. And on the subject of troodontids from Mongolia, we have Urbacodon norelli, which is a new species of troodontid coming from Mongolia. It's really great for preserving lots of these small dromaeosaurs and troodontids. This one, though, is closer to that newer group of troodontids that seem to have moved into the area. Specifically, it seems really closely related to North American troodontids, meaning troodontids probably started in parts of Asia, migrated across the Bering Land Bridge into North America, and then some of them actually migrated back and began to start living in places where the first ones had lived. This paper also gives us overall a much better look at what the kind of ancestral trait of different para-avian or near-avian groups would have been. And that's because they did ancestral state reconstruction. So essentially, okay, well, we have all of these data points. What would the common ancestor of all of these animals been most likely to be like? And they do this for all kinds of things, for tooth shape and construction and denticles. There's a lot in there. But it is really good for understanding, at least a little bit more, the early history of the para-avians. But throughout Asia, the troodontids wouldn't have been the main predators. Instead, it would have largely been tyrannosaurs during the late Cretaceous. And that includes with the Alioramines, which were relatively long-snouted tyrannosaurs, as opposed to the ones with the big, bulky heads like you see in Tyrannosaurus. While there's been a ton of work done on the bite forces of the tyrannosaurids, there really hasn't been a lot done in Alioramines up until this paper, which found that they would have had bite forces not quite as significant as those in things like Tyrannosaurus rex or Daspletosaurus, these larger-headed tyrannosaurs. Instead, it's more in line with other non-tyrannosaur theropods, which still obviously did very well. They were very large and able to hunt just fine. What this does mean, though, is potentially the Alioramines were actually targeting different prey than tyrannosaurids, and some of them did live alongside very large tyrannosaurids like Tarbosaurus. We can look at some other tyrannosaurs, though, specifically young tyrannosaurids like Gorgosaurus, which was found to have recently been actually eating primarily legs from relatively small and swift prey, notably the Oviraptorans. So overall, it seems like there's some level of niche partitioning within the tyrannosaurs, with the tyrannosaurids targeting larger prey and the Alioramines targeting smaller prey. As for the Tyrannosaurus, there's a big paper that was talked about where, ooh, look, Tyrannosaurus could have been 70% larger than we ever knew, and It's all just stats. That's all this is. If you think about your normal bell curve for growth, you're going to have some individuals that are really small on this part of it, some that are really large on this part of it, and a whole lot right in the middle where it's very tall. This paper essentially just looked at the number of Tyrannosaurus rex specimens we have and went, okay, well, statistically, they're all most likely to be right here in the middle as they're not varying that much when they're adults, and that means there's potentially some that could reach much larger sizes that we just don't have fossils of. It's just statistics. That's all this paper is saying. But the Tyrannosauroids didn't start out super large. In fact, you could look at things like Guandalong and go, yeah, that's a relatively modest-sized dinosaur. This paper, though, was looking at CT scans of the jaws to try and understand how they would have replaced their teeth. What you can see from the 3D scans is the new tooth actually growing into the other one kind of from the side as opposed to directly below. This is interesting because when we're looking at tooth replacement in lizards, that's more the pattern you see, whereas crocodilians are actually more closely related to dinosaurs, and they actually grow in the new teeth from basically directly below the old one. So it's a massive change from what we might have expected, just looking at modern day examples. This also tracks with the Eanthornines, which were still toothed birds and had the more croc-like pattern of the new tooth coming in straight below. So it seems like the Tyrannosaurs still had this kind of older system, which still functions just fine as we see in lizards, of growing in the teeth from the side. And it's just very specific preferences for things like the Eanthornines, the toothed birds, and the crocodilians that cause this shift in tooth replacement. Scorpiovenator is one of the best known abelisaurs, this strange group of theropods with exceedingly short arms. And by exceedingly short, I mean even shorter relative to their body than what we find in tyrannosaurs. In fact, they didn't even have wrist bones. That said, this paper wasn't looking at the arms, but instead the hind limbs, and especially the pelvis and the legs, to try and understand what kind of musculature they would have supported, so they could understand just how it might have functioned as far as being able to run around and move. The paper didn't actually talk about any sort of specific speed components and how quickly it might have been moving, but they did reconstruct basically all of the muscles down to the toes. So it's a very good representation of what a theropod foot should look like if it were fully muscled, but also that goes all the way up into the hips. So hopefully these researchers can try and provide a better idea of how quickly this animal would have been running in the future. And I say that specifically because it seems like abelisaurs may have kind of been the cheetahs of the dinosaur world, running very rapidly. Abelisaurs are very well known from South America, and that includes the Baru group of Brazil. This paper looked at that group and was able to find a broad diversity of different theropods that would have been living in Brazil during the late Cretaceous. And that includes things like Eanthornines, the toothed birds that I mentioned earlier, but also raptor-type dinosaurs, dromaeosaurs, as well as abelisaurs and even megaraptorans, which are kind of weird group of theropods that are normally not preserved very well, so hopefully there will be more research on them in the future. But it really just goes to show that this wasn't necessarily what we are seeing in the late Cretaceous of the northern continents, where it seems like tyrannosaurs started to take over a lot more of these niches. Instead, there was still a lot of theropod diversity in the southern continents. But it wasn't just theropods in the Baru group, there were also titanosaurian sauropods, like Troodontid. And this paper was looking at its skeleton to try and understand how it might have functioned, similar to the Scorpiovenator paper I mentioned earlier. This paper wasn't looking at the legs, though. Instead it was looking at the backbone, and especially in the neck, to try and understand what kind of range of motion Troodontid might have had. What they found is it likely would have been fairly comfortable holding its head relatively high, being able to feed off of plants that were relatively high compared to the ground. This is interesting because when you're looking at very, very large titanosaurs like Argentinosaurus, it seems like they couldn't lift their head quite as much, and were likely sweep feeding over large areas by just moving their neck and staying in one spot, because that neck could still cover a large area. Meanwhile, Troodontid was feeding higher up, and that may be in part due to its size being closer to that of an elephant as opposed to a herd of elephants. So it seems like there was some niche partitioning occurring in the titanosaurs between the large ones and the absolutely massive ones. There was also a look at some of the large sauropods coming from the Morrison Formation of North America. Specifically, they were looking at things like Diplodocus halorum, as well as Supersaurus. And what they found is not necessarily anything that exciting. What they did is they chopped open the bones, made thin sections, and looked at essentially the age of these animals. And what they found is that, they're just really old examples of their species. So potentially, sure, other sauropods could have reached these same sizes, or at least similar sizes. But they just died before they got that old, and it seems like the sauropods likely had indeterminate growth. where they always keep growing, but it's kind of logarithmic, where sure there's a big spike at the beginning and then it kind of plateaus, but that plateau is always kind of sloped, so it's continuing to grow, just not quite as rapidly. Melargosaurus and Photogenognosaurus are two large sauropods coming from the Argentine Portuelo Formation. And this paper was looking at all of the sauropod material coming from the formation to figure out if there might have been more diversity. And the answer is maybe. There's a lot of isolated vertebra that can't be assigned to either of these specific species. However, when they did actually do some phylogenetic studies, they did find that some of it plotted fairly closely to Melargosaurus. None of it really, though, plotted close to Photogenognosaurus. What this means is that there's potentially more than one species of Melargosaurus, or at least something closely related to Melargosaurus, also in the same formation. We just haven't found enough body fossils of it to really identify it as a species. And that's just because you need really diagnostic traits to be able to tell if it is a new species or not. And it's a vertebra, but it's not detailed enough to be able to really do that yet. Staying with animals that had long necks, we're actually looking at one that had a short neck, and that's Leopleurodon, a short-necked plesiosaur, as opposed to the more commonly thought of long-necked plesiosaurs. Leopleurodon would have lived in Europe during the Middle Jurassic, and there's new fossils coming from France which really help to show this. Importantly, some of these specimens are actually fairly young, and they show things like a lack of cervical fusion. Essentially, the parts of the neck aren't actually fusing into solid bones, there's still a lot of cartilage involved. This is something that has been suggested in the past to potentially only really occur in fully grown adult Leopleurodon and other short-necked plesiosaurs. This young specimen really helps to support that idea, and that tracks with what we see in modern-day crocodilians, which oftentimes don't actually fuse certain parts of their neck vertebra because they're trying to achieve larger sizes, and not fusing it allows that vertebra to grow a little bit more easily. Leopleurodon would have lived in a warm archipelago in Europe, but not all of the plesiosaurs were actually living in warm places, and that includes some coming from northern Germany. The fossils come from a relatively small area from about Hamburg to the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea. And this is interesting because, again, this would have been colder and also from the Cretaceous, meaning, it wasn't quite the same warm archipelago, although it would have still been largely an archipelago. What this means is essentially, plesiosaurs were getting all around the world and living in different places. Additionally, they did do micro-CT scans on these fossils to see some of the internal anatomy, and they do lay out some different structures that are present. It's likely that these will be compared to other species to see what kind of trends we can see in plesiosaur neck vertebra evolution. Staying in the oceans, but jumping all the way back to the Triassic though, we also have bromelites, which are essentially just any feeding trace. And by that I mean like the actual digestive system, not just, hey, something was feeding on this animal. And these ones specifically contain conodonts, which were these weird tube-like vertebrates, or at least close to vertebrates, which would have had 5 teeth or sets of teeth, but no jaws. They're really odd animals, and now they're extinct, so we can't know that much about them, but strange. Regardless, this is the first time we're really finding them as bromelites, meaning, hey, look, we can show these were a very important part of the ecosystem and the food web. They weren't just kind of going out there and filter feeding on their own, eating small plankton. Instead, they were also getting eaten by other animals. And there seems to be a good wide spread of it, including some ammonites, things like the thylacocephalians, these weird crustaceans, as well as things like coelacanths, and even potentially other conodonts eating young ones. So we're just finally getting a better picture of what kind of role the conodonts might have played in an ecosystem. Aramicharminus is a new species of pseudoseuchian from the Middle Triassic of Nevada, and it's unique in a few ways. First of all, from what we can tell, it would have lived on land but got washed into marine sediments of the Favorite Formation. So it was living on land and got washed out there, but that also means it may have been spending a lot of time close to the ocean's edge. It also plots very closely with things like Chianosuchus coming from China and Arizonosaurus from Arizona. This one being from Nevada, it's not too far away from that, but again, more marine setting. Chianosuchus, though, was suggested to have potentially been marine, although more recent studies have suggested it wasn't necessarily that great in the water. It still would have managed, but it wasn't like it was spending all of its time there. That said, the name Penguin-Wishingasuchus is from the Shoshone term for catching fish. So they were really suggesting that this animal would have been near the water and at least hunting at the water's edge for this large ocean that would have existed off of that side of North America on the edge of Pangaea. They suggest that it was probably at least somewhat aquatic and doing a lot of hunting in the water, potentially like a polar bear, which can sure swim very long distances and can dive fairly well, although this animal didn't have as dense of bones, so maybe not quite as well as a diver as polar bears, but that's not all polar bears do. They do spend a lot of time on land as well. But there was another paper on Baiyinosaurus, and that's really interesting because this paper was actually looking at its growth, and despite its relatively small size, especially compared with larger animals like Arizonosaurus, it was fully grown. While our Arizonosaurus would have been about 10 feet long or around 3 meters, this animal would have been probably under a meter in total length, so under 3 feet. It certainly wasn't getting that large. This suggests that it was really hyper-adapted to this kind of coastal environment, and even if it wasn't catching fish, different crabs and other animals in the littoral zone would have been very good prey, the littoral zone being the area that is actually affected by tidal changes. It also would have had relatively slow growth rates, which isn't something we expected, especially when looking at other things related to the poposaurids. That includes some animals like Ephigia, which actually would have been an herbivorous croc relative. Those had much faster growth rates, and it helps us suggest that potentially at the base of the archosaur tree, they were overall slower growing. They also have parallel fibered bone, which is something you do expect in slower growing animals that are more ectothermic as opposed to endothermic, so closer to cold-bloodedness than warm-bloodedness. What this means is there's not really a good strong pattern for different amounts of metabolism in the archosaurs. So maybe they were all ancestrally cold-blooded, or maybe they were all ancestrally warm-blooded. We don't know. It is also interesting, though, because it might be some evidence that Baiyinosaurus wasn't actually in the water that much when hunting, because as animals progressively become more adapted to aquatic environments, especially vertebrates that are moving back into the water, they tend to adopt more endothermic body plans and metabolisms in order to keep their body temperatures up while swimming in the cold sea. Still in the Triassic, though, we have Pterosaurus, which would have been a small, about fox-sized animal that would have actually been pretty closely related to modern-day crocodilians. That said, it would have been a crocodilomorph, not a crocodiliform, which is the group that includes modern-day crocodilians. So close, but not exactly the same. This paper looked at the bone structures and found that it was pretty similar to non-crocodilian crocodilomorphs and still pretty different from early crocodiliforms like Hesperorhynchus. So it's really suggesting that there was a very significant change in the evolution of crocodiliforms, which allowed them to be more successful and actually potentially survive through the Triassic extinction, where all of these other crocodilian relatives didn't. Claw, the new Drepanosaur species that was named, and it is quite literally just the name, a single claw. And more seriously, it does have a real name that just translates to claw. Unguinicus onyx is the name, and again, just one claw. But that is one of the most distinctive features of Drepanosaurs, this strange group of reptiles from the Triassic that had various lifestyles, some of them digging underground and many living in trees. It's from the eastern New Mexican Garita Springs Formation, and helps add to a growing diversity of these animals that we're finding in the Triassic, even in North America, where there's been plenty of prospecting and now people are just looking at smaller fossils. This includes some things coming from the Chinle Formation just a few years ago, like Skybalonyx, as well as other things that people have talked about at Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meetings, but none of that is peer-reviewed and published yet, so you're going to have to wait for that. But these very strange reptiles are seemingly getting a kind of renaissance of their own, like the dinosaur renaissance, as more people are starting to look at them. Nautiloids still exist in the modern day, and they're the closest thing we have to ammonites while not actually being ammonites, at least as far as their shell construction of having these large shells and still living in the water. Meanwhile, ammonites themselves were still closer to modern-day squid and octopods. That said, it's not just ammonites that have a great fossil record, nautiloids do too, and that includes with their beaks, the radula. What these researchers did is micro-CT scanned over 250 specimens, both modern and fossil, of these radula from different nautiloids. What they found is there is actually a decent amount of disparity and differences in the growth of the radula for potentially just targeting different prey or scavenging in different ways. There were also notable changes over time. For example, in the Cretaceous, the beak shape matches basically nothing in the modern day, and also nothing from the Triassic. So there is a lot of change in this group that's often been thought of as kind of living fossils. Oh yeah, they just kind of stayed at the bottom of the ocean and did nothing evolutionarily. They did a lot, actually. It's just hard to tell that when you're just glancing at them. And so hopefully more techniques like this will be used on more fossils in the future so people can get a better understanding of the broad diversity of life in the fossil record. There was also a look at the Lagerstätte from the late Cretaceous of Lebanon, which preserved tons of marine life. It's actually really wonderful to see so many well-preserved fossils. Additionally, it looks like there's multiple layers of this formation and of these different Lagerstätte, with some being more offshore and some being closer to shore. So it's a really good look at what was happening in the oceans during the late Cretaceous in the build-up to the mass extinction that killed off the non-avian dinosaurs and a lot of other life. Additionally, I did an interview with the author, which hopefully will be coming out soon, where we talked about some of the fossils of Lebanon and Palestine. There was also a look at other fossils from Lebanon, more specifically in Lebanese amber, and this time they were looking at lice, and this is really interesting because this is also from the late Cretaceous, but importantly, right around the time that birds were starting to diversify, as well as mammals were starting to diversify into more niches throughout their environment. What this means is that lice, which are now most commonly found on birds and mammals, were also just kind of static until at this point where they could start radiating even more. And so what we're starting to see with some of these fossils of 14 different species of lice is some of the early steps towards those radiations, although they still don't really seem specialized for things like birds or mammals just yet. Instead, they're more generalists. Staying in insects, we have sawflies, which look like wasps but aren't, although they are in the same order, Hymenoptera. These authors describe 5 new genera coming from both Baltic amber and Ukrainian amber from the Eocene about 50 million years ago. And from that, they're able to say, hey, look, these 3 different subclades of sawflies would have all diversified by at least the Eocene, which is really useful for reconstructing their modern-day phylogenies because you can say it needs to have split by at least then. And so we have a minimum age for those groups. There's also a large review paper which looked at the evidence for wildfires in the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous is so named because it's carbon-bearing. There's a lot of coal in those seams, at least from large parts of Europe, including the UK. This is important though because that also means there was a lot of plant life fixing CO2. Essentially, it's bringing CO2 into the bark to build the structure of the actual plant and then releasing a lot of oxygen. That oxygen then would have made a very oxygen-rich environment, which means if there was a spark, fire would just run rampant. And this paper looked at a lot of that evidence in order to help us understand how different wildfires can actually interact with the environment in different ways, especially as at the end of the Carboniferous, there was a massive rainforest collapse, which caused a lot of changes to the environments. One of the biggest parts of plant studies, though, is actually palynology, which is studying pollen. You look at these microscopes and go for teeny tiny grains of pollen and go, hey, it's this kind of plant or this kind of plant. The question is, how many is actually a good sample size of pollen grains to look at to understand an environment? 100? 200? 8,000? They're very small and they're very prevalent in sediment, so you can get up to those numbers of grains. This paper did a lot of statistical methods using multiple localities to try and answer that question, and found that pretty reliable understandings of the environment can be found at about 700 grains, which is far less than some papers that have suggested 2,000 grains, and still quite a bit more than some papers that have suggested only 100 grains. So, palynologists, correct me if I'm wrong, stats and palynology is not my thing, but we're starting to build better methods for understanding these environments just by using statistics to understand the fossil record better. As for palynology and pollen, there was a major change during the Mesozoic around the Jurassic to the Cretaceous transition, and that's with the presence of angiosperms, flowering plants. But for the evolution of angiosperms, there would be no flowering plants and no true fruit. Meanwhile, angiosperms, once they evolved, were able to develop the flowers to increase pollination, and then also produce fruit in order to help protect the seeds inside. The El Chingo Lagerstätte in Mexico actually shows some different interactions between angiosperms and insects, both of which we have good genetic data for as increasing in diversity during the early Cretaceous as angiosperms took off. So angiosperms took off and the insects followed because there was just more habitat and more niches for them to fill. However, a lot of the fossils in this area actually show damage on angiosperm plants by insects, be it feeding, be it making little nests in there, or potentially even just creating different cavities that they could lay eggs in. What this means is that there is a lot of complexity to these interactions. It wasn't just, oh, these plants started doing really great, so therefore all of the insects did great. No, there was a lot of give and take both ways for this most likely. And that includes when you're thinking about things like milkweed, which produces a latex substance in order to stop insects from feeding on it. So it seems like there's a lot of diversity in what these plants were doing and how they were actually able to handle living with and trying to get rid of some of the different insects that would have been around them. There's also a look at fossil woods coming from Argentina at about the same time or a little bit later, except none of these were angiosperms, they were all conifer trees, and only 2 of the specimens could actually be put into a species because they just aren't the prettiest pieces of fossilized wood. However, it does help to show that it wasn't necessarily just all at once the angiosperms took over. Instead, there are still a lot of diversity in different parts of the world. As for other fossil woods, there's some more recent ones from the Miocene of Lesbos in Greece. This island was characterized by having large tuff deposits, which is a very mineral-rich ash layer, which would have erupted from large volcanoes and then eventually drifted over the island and settled down on top of it. These minerals then allowed for the fossilization of many of the woods on the island. The tuff wasn't distributed evenly, though. It settled differently in different areas, particularly closer to the eruption. And so what it seems like is, in some of the parts closer to the eruption site, it actually would have been fossilized by high iron and magnesium content in those tuffs. And then that allowed it to precipitate into the wood and replace large parts of the minerals and the different chemicals in the wood. Meanwhile, on the other part of the island, the more southeastern side, instead you have more of the silicon, so things like quartz starting to precipitate into the wood, kind of like what you see at petrified forest. Although there are some that are actually different than that, instead having calcite help to replace it, meaning that the calcium is being drawn through in these minerals and then reacting with the wood to form calcite. So multiple different preservation types in just one island off the coast of Greece. And in the angiosperms, we still have the cornales, or the dogwoods. And the dogwoods are really interesting because when we were looking at their fossil record, like this paper did, there's an entire group of them that are entirely extinct now. And by that I mean there's enough different species of these dogwoods to all group together that we're able to go, yeah, this is an entire group, probably as rich as any modern dogwood group, but that just don't exist anymore. So it's not like it was a slow radiation of these different trees to the modern day diversity they have. Instead, there were different branches doing successfully at different times and different places. And it's really interesting to think of that there's just this entire group of trees that are just totally gone now, but were once pretty common. Jiangtungspermum ganellii is a new species of fossil legume. Legumes are still flowering plants, and you probably best know them as things like peanuts and beans. However, this one was exceedingly large, almost twice the size of its closest relatives coming from parts of Papua New Guinea and northern Australia. That also means that this fossil is able to help contain some very interesting biogeographical information, because it's not from New Guinea or Australia, instead coming from Indonesia, which sounds relatively close, and yeah, sure, but there was never a land bridge between these two areas because of the Wallace Line, which was caused by a deep ocean trench, so that even during the ice ages when ocean levels shrank, there wasn't any land bridge there. It's just too deep. What that means is either a bird carried it across onto the islands of Papua New Guinea and Australia, or potentially just wind carried it in a whole bunch of matter and plants that then they were able to germinate and start spreading across those areas. Osteoderms are bones that grow inside of the skin. You can think of the scutes on things like crocodiles as a good example of these. However, they also exist in smaller animals like skinks. And now there's evidence of the first osteoderms growing in snakes coming from Burmese amber. And there's a lot of ethical questions about this. You can check my whole video where I talk about a lot of those. So again, I really encourage you to go check that out. That said, this fossilized skink comes from this amber and shows evidence of osteoderms. Electroscincus zeti is the new species, and I really like this reconstruction because there's large parts of it that are blurred out, and that's because they just don't have that part of the fossil. It's largely just the main part of the body. That said, it's not that outlandish to say it could have been that colorful, as many skinks today are pretty colorful. Staying with reptiles, Iberia isn't known for having cobras today, but in the fossil record there's actually quite a few of them, or at least a few specimens. They all belong to the species Naha iberica, which is the modern-day genus of cobras. This means you would have had 2 different species of cobras living in parts of Europe during the Miocene about 5 to 8 million years ago. And that includes, of course, Naha iberica, which I've already mentioned, but also Naha romanii, which would have lived, again, more in Central Europe, probably coming up through Italy as opposed to parts of Iberia, where essentially, because ocean levels would have been potentially lower as the cooling started to begin the ice ages, potentially that was just the routes they were able to take. Additionally, it's not like those areas are particularly hard to get across for many animals. It's not like there's a giant seaway, it's just a large seaway. And so potentially just drifting on random pieces of driftwood could have placed them into Europe. As for Naha iberica, though, it seems like at least that one would have largely been living in pretty open grassland type environments, which when you're looking at a lot of where cobras live today in Africa and parts of India, yeah, that seems pretty consistent. Sure, there's some wooded areas, but that's not their main habitat, at least for most of the species. As for Italy during the Miocene, there was also Oreopithecus, which would have been a primate living in the area about 7.5 million years ago, and a lower jaw of it has been able to help show a few new things about the genus. It wouldn't have been super large at around 40 kilograms or about 90 pounds, however that would have made it one of the larger hominoids at the time. Now, of course, this also means that we could look at how it could have been more bipedal, and it seems like it could have been facultatively biped, meaning most of the times it would have been quadruped, but been able to walk on its hind legs for short periods, kind of like a chimpanzee. Of course, a lot of these hominids eventually moved closer to the equator, including our own lineage, where eventually becoming facultatively biped developed into full bipedality, as grasslands expanded and there weren't as many trees to hang around in the way you still see in chimpanzees where they are facultatively biped. Of course, a lot of these hominids eventually moved closer to the equator, including our own lineage, where eventually becoming facultatively biped developed into full bipedality, as grasslands expanded and there weren't as many trees to hang around in the way you still see in chimpanzees where they are facultatively biped. These researchers were looking at an upside-down Neanderthal preserved in a cave with a box of scraps. Okay, they actually didn't have just a box of scraps. They had a lot more than that, trying to use different photogrammetry methods to create 3D models of this upside-down Neanderthal that seemingly fell into this karstic cave, meaning it's a limestone cave. They did this using an endoscope, which is just essentially a long tube that you can stick down different things and be able to image what's inside of it without needing to essentially send an entire camera down there, because a lot of times different holes that animals live in, not large enough to send an entire camera down, but an endoscope could make it. This is the best imaging that's ever been done on the Alioramini man, which is what this fossil is called. Additionally, they also did imaging of other animals that have also fallen into the same cave system, though not at the same spot, such as some early horses. So it's really great to see some new techniques being used to understand better what this cave system was like and hopefully explore it for more fossils in the future. A 32,000-year-old subadult woolly rhino was also described, which is really interesting because most of the specimens we have are either very young, between 1 and 1.5 years, or fully grown, making this 4-year-old, just about, specimen really good for filling in that gap of how they grew into the giant behemoths that we know them as, especially when you're looking at some of the really large woolly rhinos. This one is also a little bit better preserved, and it helps to show that the muscle hump that they had to help hold up their large heads and large horns actually would have been covered with a layer of fat as well. So it wasn't just muscle that was stored in their hump, they also had fat. There's also a look at the Siwalik Hills in the Himalayas, essentially the foothills of the Himalayas. And what this paper was doing was using software called MaxEnt to try and understand what places might be most likely to preserve fossils. And this was done using geologic and satellite maps in order to try and find good sites. And they actually did find a few. So it's helping to make these researchers more efficient at finding fossils because it can help to direct them towards where fossils are more likely to be, which when you're considering pretty rugged terrain, that's a great feature to have and a great software to use. Sinitris and Latravus are early mustelids, so weasel-like animals coming from China. This paper looked at their occurrences to try and understand A, what they were closest related to, and how they might have dispersed across large parts of Asia and across North America as well. These fossils, as well as a newly found one, Schansictus zinjuensis, are able to suggest that Cernictus and Schansictus are early lycodonines, which now live in Central and South America and includes the Patagonian weasel and the Grisons. Meanwhile, Latravus would have been an early Ichnini, which is actually more commonly found in Africa now, except for the marbled polecat, which lives all across Central Eurasia. These fossils would also have been from the Miocene about 5 to 11 million years ago, and so it really goes to show just how quickly these different lineages were able to spread across the world into different environments. There's also a new data set being made using hex grids to show different parts of the world, and you can use really high fidelity or really low fidelity. And this is useful for understanding biogeographic distributions of different fossils. This is especially true as you can actually apply this same hex grid to the different continents at different times. So you can really understand what the kind of biogeographical distribution was for different groups by essentially filling in this hex grid and using other software to really measure that in a more quantitative way. Mammals are generally thought of as having a large EQ, so encephalization quotient, that is a large brain for their body size. What this paper did is actually looked at a whole bunch of mammals to see how much that holds to be the case. They found that this kind of idea that just increasing body size inherently also increases relative brain size only actually occurs in 3 different groups of the mammals. And that's the primates, like us, but also rodents and general carnivorans. So it doesn't even seem like cetaceans, the whales, actually do the same kind of thing, despite being very intelligent. This is really interesting and kind of just throws a wrench into a lot of the gears, kind of the assumptions about mammals being smarter than everything else. Potentially they're just doing that because they're larger, so their brain is staying relatively the same size, but it's larger overall. And then, of course, you have certain things where, yeah, sure, it increases even more additionally, and those groups are pretty far and few between. Kind of like what we see actually in the dinosaurs, where, sure, troodontids do increase their body size, and they also increase their brain size, but that pattern doesn't hold with most of the other dinosaurs. This paper looked at mammals and mammal fossils to try and understand what the hypothetical ancestral mammal would have been like, what its kind of behaviors would have been, and what traits it would have been. Essentially, if you look at the great-great-grandfather of all mammals, what would it have been like? What they found is that a lot of these different traits that we think of in mammals, such as being more upright, having less ribs down all the body, and also things like cheeks and producing milk, likely evolved in sync. That is to say that as they moved more upright, they needed fewer ribs and changes to the back in order to support their body. Additionally, they needed cheeks in order to drink milk, which means those probably evolved at the same time. So it seems like the ancestral mammal probably had a lot of traits we already associate with mammals because they were already evolving and co-evolving in many cases. It wasn't just, oh, well, it was upright and then the back changed. Both of those happened at the same time. We also often think of mammals, especially early mammals, as being burrowers, but there were also dinosaurs that seemingly burrowed, especially the Thescelosaurians. Fauna herzogi from the Cedar Mountain Formation is a new Thescelosaurian coming from the early Cretaceous of North America. This is the earliest known Thescelosaurian and shows that they were in North America by the early Cretaceous and also living on the same continent as their sister group, the Oreodromines, which were also probably burrowing at least some of the time. That said, I said the same continent, not the same habitat. It does seem like there was some spatial partitioning there, so potentially they were still burrowing just in different places and kind of excluding each other from entering each other's habitats, just based on potentially competition for different food resources. Compsognathus chasei is a new iguanodontian from the Wessex Formation of England, and it's the most complete iguanodontian ever found in the Wessex Formation, which doesn't say a lot, because when you look at it, sure, there's some decent pieces, but it's still not as nice as what you find in many other places. Still though, finding a new species helps us to understand the broader diversity that would have been living in parts of England, as well as the broader European archipelago during the Cretaceous. Gaiacia geniae is a new massive tetrapod coming from the southern continents during the Permian, and specifically it's from Namibia, and this is really interesting because this is essentially when we had thought most of these tetrapodomorph, these things closely related to tetrapods, had more or less died out and been replaced by amphibians and temnospondyls, so at least amphibian relatives in many of these environments. Meanwhile, then suddenly we just find one giant one that was probably the apex predator in the river systems it was living in. Most of these kinds of animals lived during the Carboniferous, when there would have been massive rainforests like I talked about beforehand. But with the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, a lot of those environments changed due to glaciation and, again, just massive cooling. This includes in places like Namibia, which would have been closer to the poles at this time. So despite a suddenly very broad shift from warm to very cold habitats, it seemingly did very well for itself. Moving even further back in time, though, and into the oceans, we have some of the lobopodians, which are these animals that are closely related to both arthropods, but also are probably more closely related to modern-day velvet worms, which are pretty rare but very interesting animals. Microdictyon would have been one of these, and it shows evidence of early molting, and it wouldn't have been quite as armored as what we see in modern-day arthropods with, full exoskeletons. However, it would have had these patches of sclerites, essentially hardened material, that seem to have shed. And that's based on new fossils where you can actually see this process kind of happening, where one of those sclerites is starting to pop off and you can see the under one underneath it. This kind of pattern is actually pretty similar to what we see in modern-day armored tardigrades, which means essentially this lineage would have been armored with the tardigrades, had some of them stay armored and some of them not, then also had that trait, maintained it into the velvet worms, where some of them had it, and then many of them, at least in the modern day, lost that trait, and then maintained that armor all the way into the arthropods, where all of them have it today. Panochthus Burmeister is a new, almost vertebrate from the Margin Formation of Utah. It had some of the vertebrate traits we expect, such as a post-anal tail, that is, a tail that extends past where the anus is, as well as the gill arches we do see in modern vertebrates. However, there's still a lot of questions about when exactly vertebrates evolved, and what is and isn't a vertebrate when you're looking at the very base of the tree. This phylogeny does a great job of showing that, where there's different traits starting to be picked up by different members of this kind of stem chordate and stem vertebrate lineage, and hopefully we'll get some more fossils of these that are a little bit better preserved that show some more of these traits so we can really understand how vertebrate life started to develop. Baiyinosaurus is a new, at least relative to the arthropods, and it was micro-CT scanned because it seemed like there might be some internal structures preserved, and they certainly were, including parts of the gut, brain cases, various body cavities, and some of the sinuses. This gives a kind of idealized view of what many of these early arthropod relatives would have been built like in the fossil record 500 and some odd million years ago. So really exciting to start understanding this, especially as more of these fossils are being found that preserve some of the internal structures in early arthropod relatives. So slowly but surely we're developing a really good understanding of how arthropods actually developed, and hopefully eventually we'll find some things that fit more accurately into modern groups so we can understand how they changed those initial systems through time. There was also a look at the faunas that existed from the Ediacaran into the Cambrian, when the Cambrian explosion happens and the very basic animal life that we had in the Ediacaran just massively expanded. What they found is that each of the different Ediacaran to Cambrian transitions that we have is coinciding with a massive transgressive sea event. That is, the sea level rose, covered at least that area of the land into a shallow sea where life was able to develop even more rapidly. And then there is a paper looking at creationism and how teaching it in the classroom can be a negative impact on overall science education, which should not be that shocking. It fundamentally just limits the ability of people to trust science, which also leads to things like vaccine denial, which is not ideal when there's a global pandemic like there was just a few years ago. Get your vaccines. The paper also goes on to show how believing in evolution and learning evolution doesn't actually at all preclude people from believing in God, which is totally fine, right? Like, people can believe in whatever God they want to. It's just a matter of also understanding where we are in the modern world so you can understand how the world was developed, be it by a god or by random chance. That's up to you to decide. The important thing is we need to know how it happened so that we can help take care of it in the future. And then for a paper I did an entire video on, we have Asia tyrannus, which was deep-snouted, more like Tarbosaurus or Tyrannosaurus, but lived alongside a larger Alioramini, which is essentially just very strange because when I was talking about this earlier, you remember me saying, oh yeah, the Alioramines were probably going after smaller prey. They didn't have as big of a jaw, but in this case, potentially the opposite is true. Or potentially they were just living in that environment at different times. It's hard to know for sure. That said, it is very interesting to find another new tyrannosaur, seemingly from the more North American Tyrannosaurid lineage, as opposed to just being a generic Tyrannosauroid. So, really interesting. Hopefully we'll see some more research on that in the future. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Between everything, this clearly got out late, but we are still working on catching up. It was exciting to meet some of you guys at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting. Again, just those of you that I did meet, great. If I missed you there, I apologize. Hopefully next year, which is a longer trip, so maybe not next year, we'll find out. But regardless, again, great to be at the meeting, great to meet people. With that said, I also want to thank the patrons, North Liu, Coxonwood, and Richard Lord. I really appreciate you guys and your help. It really helps to justify doing these very long and tedious month-end reviews, because I do see it as a service for the community, and being able to get some amount of funding for it is really nice, so I genuinely appreciate it. Thank you guys. If you also want to support the channel, you can check out our Patreon. With all that said, be safe, take care, and don't go extinct.